So about 10 years ago, there was a study done where they followed people around at Disney World and they had them kind of rate their experience on a scale of 1 to 10 throughout particular moments throughout the day. Just by a show of hands in here, raise your hand if you've been to Disney World. Wow, that's a lot more than I thought. This is a good crowd right here. This is awesome. Disney World's amazing. It's magical, right? So they had people kind of rate their experience on a scale of 1 to 10. That they went to Space Mountain was the first one, and the average score for Space Mountain was a 10. If you've done that, it's pretty awesome. It's a mountain in space. And then they did food at Disney World as well, which was a 7 out of 10. The waiting in line, not as good, a 3 out of 10. And then It's a Small World was a 5 out of 10. And they did this over and over and over again. At the end of the study, they averaged all of the scores, and the average score in all of these moments for Disney World was a 6.5 out of 10. Which for a lot of us in here, we're probably pretty surprised by that. Like most of us have had a magical experience at Disney World. But then they asked them one more question, and they said, okay, now rate your entire experience on a scale of 1 to 10. And they said, most people said it would be a 9 out of 10 was how they would rate their entire experience, different than just the average of the individual moments. This study formed the basis for, these two brothers wrote this book together. Their names are Chip and Dan Heath, and it formed the basis for this book called The Power of Moments, where they looked at significant moments, and they kind of studied how moments and what constitutes moments and significant moments in people's lives and in business. And their kind of basis for all of this was this quote right here. They said that research has found that in recalling an experience, we ignore most of what happened and focus instead on a few particular moments. So they argued that this is true in our life as well, and maybe you can relate to this, but as we look back on our stories and our lives, that we have all these moments that happen, and we don't really think about the day-to-day, mundane, week-to-week, month-to-month, but instead, the lens in which we view our life is really looking at it through the lens of particular moments that happen along the way. They even argued that you can make your life feel longer to you if you have more moments that occur more often in your story, in your journey. I want to share some of these moments in my own life, and the most powerful ones are when you have all the characteristics of a moment come together in one, and I'm sure many of you in here can relate to this, but one of the more powerful moments for me was my wedding day. When I married my wife, Ashley, she was and she still is just absolutely stunning. And I remember standing there on that day, looking at her eyes. My heart was beating fast. My senses were elevated. I had so much joy and happiness. And then there's Buck, who had done premarital counseling with us, and he'd been a mentor of ours for years. And there's just all of these kind of connection points happening, family and friends around us. It was such a moment. And then I got to share my vows with her. And this was really significant because I'd worked on these, kind of prayerfully thought through these and thought, man, what do I really want our marriage to look like? What do I want to vow to her? And so I said a sentence at the end of our vows that has kind of served as like the North Star in our marriage. And we actually got it printed out and it's hanging in our house. And I said this sentence. Here's a picture of the image. I said, for the day when we are old and wrinkly, sitting across the table from one another, and we still want to get it on. That was my vow to her, because I thought about all of it, and I was like, man, you know what would be great is if we're really old and we're really into each other still. Like, I think we would have won by that point in marriage if that was the case. So I said this, and it was really funny this week. This is taking this story way too far, but I said this week, and I was looking at the pictures to share the message, and I found the moment that I shared this with Ashley, and it was really funny, because there's a picture of when I shared it. Buck is looking at me like, what did you just say? And then here's what's the best part is I'll say things or people will do things every now and then, and Ashley's go-to response is, oh, I'm sweating. And I found this, and this is her I'm sweating stance. And it's really funny because I never realized it until this moment, but I have made her have that stance so many times throughout our marriage since then. But it was a significant moment for us. It still is. It's so treasured. I remember the moment that I became a dad, holding my son Grayson for the very first time. I mean, so much joy and happiness and that whole experience, and just not realizing that I had this entire reservoir of love inside me that I didn't even know existed until I met my son for the first time. If you're a parent, I'm sure you can relate to this, right? But what happened in this moment, there's all this joy and happiness and all these doctors around doing these tests. And there's like 7 of them. And I don't think this really happened, but this is just how I remember it per all the exhaustion. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. But they start to leave the room. And the way I remember it, I don't think this really occurred, is like the last one like saluted me, gave me a thumbs up and said, good luck. Because I'm standing there holding my son going, wait, what do I do with this thing though? Like I had never changed a diaper before. And then I'm standing there with this human being that I'm supposed to keep alive, and I'm utterly exhausted. And so it's this mixture of joy and happiness and fear and, oh no, what have we done? Is there a return policy? I don't know at this point, but I'm just kidding. I love my son. But it was a significant moment for me. I'm sure that you have your own, perhaps, in your story of life. Maybe for you it's a specific accomplishment that was really big. Perhaps for you it was where you felt connected to other people or connected to the world around you. Maybe it was when you discovered something, an epiphany that kind of changed the trajectory of your life. These are all moments that serve as kind of these marker points, these marker moments that really define what happens in our stories and our life. And today, the reason I start that way is today what we're going to do is as we finish up this series, Investigating Jesus today, we're going to look at a marker moment that defined the story of Jesus of Nazareth. This individual, this man that we've been investigating the past couple of weeks, a Jewish carpenter who made a dent in history like no other. And throughout this series, we've been asking this really important question that we all face at some point in our life, that is, who is Jesus? Who was this man that made such a dent in history? There are a lot of other good questions to ask, helpful questions. Does God exist? What about creation? What about the Bible? All of these. But when you are exploring Christianity, you can just go right to the source. The crucial question in Christianity is, who is Jesus? Because the Christian faith rises and falls on the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. It all hinges on who Jesus is, who he claimed to be, because if he's not who he claimed to be, he's crazy, he's a liar, well, we can just go on throughout our day. But if he is really who he claimed to be, he is God, then it changes everything in our life. The implications are endless. And so we've been going through this series, having this conversation. We've really tried to make it more of a conversation by asking you to submit the questions that you have about Jesus and spirituality and Christianity. And you've been doing that, and we're so grateful you've submitted these questions. We've had great conversations on our Overtime podcast each week, and today is no different. If you have a pushback, if you have a comment, if you have a question at any point in today's message, you can scan the QR code in the seat in front of you, or you can go to mpaustin.com/what's-next, and you can submit your questions there. Our teaching team, we're going to do our best to answer them again in our Overtime podcast that releases on Wednesday this week. But we've been talking about lots of different ways of investigating Jesus, the reliability of the gospel accounts. We've been talking about who Jesus claimed to be and what kind of validates that, and how do we explore whether he really is who he claimed to be, the ways in which Jesus meets all of our desires and fears and kind of core needs that we have regardless of our wiring, our personality. And today, as we wrap up this series, what we're going to do is look at one of the marker moments in Jesus' life. And I do want to let you know ahead of time, you are already familiar with this moment. It was really the climax of the story. Everything had led up to this significant moment in Jesus' life. In fact, the gospel writers, they wrote more about this 24-hour time period than any other place in the gospel relative to anything else in Jesus' life and ministry. There was more written about this 24-hour time period. It's like they wanted us to understand both what happened and why it was so significant. And the thing we're going to look at is the death and crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. And you already know this story maybe from afar, but I do want to give a heads up because of the nature of how the story of Jesus ended, which we have to investigate. If we are to investigate the identity of Jesus, we have to investigate his death. But given the nature of how his story ended, I want to give a heads up that today's sermon would be a little bit more graphic, maybe a little bit heavier for a lot of us. And we don't do this every Sunday, but I just want you guys to know that ahead of time. But what I want to invite you to do as we go through it is try to look at this with a little bit of a different lens. What I want you to do is kind of put yourself in the shoes of a bystander, of someone who's kind of watching from a distance this entire thing unfold all the way up to the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus. I want you to be asking yourself the question, what is really happening here? And more importantly, why is this happening? Why is this how the story is ending? Because the very reason this is the way the story is ending is the reason why the story of Jesus becomes a part of your story and my story, because it changed everything. And so the story of Jesus, the end of Jesus' life, begins the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's right outside of Jerusalem. And up until this point, I want to catch you up on what's happening up until this point. You see, Jesus' ministry had been going on. He had these crowds, this public following all around him. But he had claimed to be God. And that had really angered the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees. And since then, they'd been trying to trap him and kill him and figure out a way to get him away from the crowds so they could prosecute him and get him executed. And so this is what is happening up until this point. And they finally strike up a deal with Judas, one of the 12 disciples, and they pay him money to give up Jesus' location and where he's at when there are no crowds around. And so in the middle of the night, Jesus is praying. He's with his other disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where the story begins. It says this, the Apostle John writes, Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him. So he stepped forward to meet them. Who are you looking for? He fully realized, he fully understood, he had alluded to it many times. The disciples of Jesus did not fully understand, but he knew it was about to happen. And he says, who are you looking for? Jesus the Nazarene, they replied. And then look at this. He says, I am he, Jesus said. And this is important. If we go back to part 2, that statement, I am, is actually, when it references back to the book of Exodus, it's saying, I am he. Not only that, but I am God, the very one that the people who sent you are trying to persecute and execute. It's Jesus just owning right then and there, I'm the one you're looking for. And so they take him to the house of the high priest. And it goes on, it says, inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. But Jesus understands what he's trying to get at here. Jesus replied, everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. He's saying, listen, you have plenty to go off of here. Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest? He demanded. And see, at this point is really like a turning point in the story of Jesus, because he's standing there alone in the house of the people who are trying to kill him. He had just been betrayed by one disciple. There was another disciple, Peter, at this point that was denying him. People said, hey, aren't you with him? And he's like, no, I don't know the guy. The other disciples were running for their lives, scared to death that this would happen to them as well. And I'd imagine as a bystander watching this happen, we are beginning to think, whoa. This guy has had this amazing following. What is Jesus? What exactly are you doing here? And so the story continues. It says, Jesus' trial before Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. In order to get what they wanted, they had to escalate this higher to the Roman authorities who ruled over the Jewish people at this time. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, what is your charge against this man? Why have you brought him to me? We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal, they retorted. And so at this point, what happens is Pilate's beginning to go, okay, why are you bringing this to me? What's the significance of this man? Why should I even care? Pilate responds, then take him away and judge him by your own law, Pilate told them. And then we see why they brought Jesus to him. Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone. You see, normally Pilate wouldn't really care about this Messiah guy. Like, he's not Jewish. He doesn't know the context and all of that. And they just rule over the Jewish people, so it doesn't matter to him. But they begin to kind of work the Roman system. And so Pilate brings Jesus into his headquarters. They begin to have a conversation. He questions Jesus. He interrogates him. But he doesn't see a reason to execute this man. But at the same time, outside of the headquarters, it is now morning. And the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are kind of brewing this crowd. This bloodlust is growing, and Pilate knows he's going to have to do something to satiate the bloodlust of the crowd and the Jewish leaders in order to avoid an uprising. And so he does something instead. He doesn't see a reason to execute him, so instead it says in one sentence, then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. And in one sentence, it describes what happened to Jesus in this moment. And the reason it's one sentence is because anybody in the first century who was reading this, the writers didn't need to explain what happened to someone during a Roman flogging. But 2,000 years later, we have to piece it together based on archaeology and historical works that actually give us a very specific picture of what happened in a Roman flogging. You see, there would have been a Roman soldier that would have given 39 lashes. Depending on the mood of the soldier, it might have been more. It was done with a leather whip that had these metal balls woven into it, so when they hit the body, it would cause these deep bruisings. Eventually, these bruises would open up. In between the metal balls on the whip, there were bones that had been sharpened to a point, and so when the bruises caused them to open up, the bones would rip into them, and they would pull the flesh off of someone's back. It was so brutal, it was intended to torture somebody. Historians look back on flogging and they'd say it would have been common from the back of the shoulders all the way down to the legs, it would have been common for the bones of the spine to be visible and ribbons of flesh to be hanging off of someone's body when it was done. Roman floggings would often kill people or leave them in critical condition. And in one sentence, it describes this happening to Jesus of Nazareth. And then from there, the Roman soldiers who did this to Jesus, they hear that he's been called King of the Jews. And so they begin to mock him for this. It says, the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. Hail, King of the Jews, they mocked, as they slapped him across the face. Pilate hopes that this will be enough to satiate the bloodlust of the crowd. So he brings him out. It says, Pilate went outside and said to the people, I am going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty. Again, Pilate doesn't see a reason. Maybe he's just crazy, but he doesn't see a reason to execute him. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said, look, here is the man. And if we are a bystander, again, watching this unfold, we would have seen Jesus come out very different than we saw him go in. We would have seen this man who's had this amazing following go in and then come out with a crown of thorns on his head, a purple robe drenched in blood, flesh maybe hanging from his body, hard to stand on his own, maybe leaning on something or someone in order just to stand up. And again, I think we see this man come out and go, Jesus, why are you letting this happen to you? Pilate hopes that this will satiate the bloodlust, but that's not the case. It says, when they saw him, the leading priests and the temple guards began shouting, crucify him, crucify him. They show what they ultimately have wanted all along, and they continue to push for execution. But again, Pilate doesn't see the reason for this. He brings Jesus back in. They have this conversation. It's almost like he tries to give Jesus an out at this point, but Jesus doesn't take it. And so it says that Pilate tried to release him. But the Jewish leaders shouted, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar. And here's where they really worked the Roman Empire, because at this point in history within the Roman Empire, there was nobody that should challenge the divinity, the authority of the Roman ruler, the Roman emperor, the Roman king. And so they're trying to create this perception to Pilate, hey, if you don't do something about this, that means you're not doing your job, and that means you are no friend of Caesar. They say, away with him, crucify him. He says, what, crucify your king? Pilate asked. And then they put the nail in the coffin of their enemy, Jesus of Nazareth, with this last sentence that puts Pilate in this precarious position where he only has one thing he can do to avoid the uprising that is coming. They shout back, we have no king but Caesar. The leading priests shout back. So because of this, Pilate does what they asked. Then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus away. He went to the place called Place of the Skull, in Hebrew means Golgotha, and there they nailed him to the cross. And once again, there is just one sentence to describe what happens here, because, again, a first century writer doesn't need to explain to a first century reader what being nailed to a cross means. They were very familiar with it. This was the mode of execution that the Persians invented and the Romans perfected it. And it was done in such a way to maximize and inflict as much pain as possible, to die in the most humiliating and shameful way, hung before everybody to see, to dissuade any disobedience to the Roman Empire. They understood how gruesome and real and terrible it was. To us, it's a necklace, or it's a symbol that we get tattooed on our bodies. It's just this nice Western cultural symbol, but to them it was a symbol of fear and brutality. In fact, there was a word that had to be invented to describe the level of pain that one experienced in a crucifixion on a Roman cross. It was a word that wasn't in the language at the time, but the word that we know today called excruciating. It literally means out of the cross. Jesus was taken to Golgotha, and what happens is he had been laid on his back, his arms on the horizontal beam, his shoulders would have been stretched out of their sockets 6 inches, and then there would have been 5 to 7 inch Roman nails that had been sharpened to a point that would go through his wrists. There's a common perception that we often kind of see and read about that it goes through the middle of his hand, but in the first century, the word for hand kind of constituted hand, wrist, forearm, all of it together. And archaeological evidence, we've found people with nails going through the bones of their wrists, attaching them to olive wood. And so we assume the Romans put it through his wrist, and they would do this for 2 reasons. One, they would do this because going through the hand, the flesh could tear and the person could fall off the cross. They wanted to make sure they didn't fall off. And not only that, but because of in the wrist, they're not medical experts, but they had perfected this over time. Within the wrist is the median nerve. And it's a nerve that is so painful when it gets crushed that medical experts say it'd be like someone taking a pair of pliers and slowly crushing your funny bone. And so this nail goes through the right wrist, Jesus. It goes through the left wrist. And then hanging on the horizontal beam, he's hoisted up onto the vertical piece in the ground. The nails go through the tops of his feet, stacked on top of one another, again going through the nerves there. And then he hangs there, and this slowly begins his long journey towards death. We think that would be enough to kill someone, but that's not how someone dies on a cross. The way in which someone dies on a cross is a slow, agonizingly long death by asphyxiation. Someone would be hanging there in the constant inhale position, and the stress on their diaphragm and muscles means that in order to breathe, in order to exhale, they have to push up through their feet in order to breathe out and then go back down. But when they do that, they're pushing up through their feet with the nail that's going through both of them, and they're scraping their bloody back against the cross every single breath. And this would go on over and over and over and over and over again for hours and hours, until finally the person would be too exhausted to breathe anymore. And the carbon dioxide that wants to get out of their body, then through breath, it has to get introduced into their bloodstream. It would start this thing called respiratory acidosis that would lead to multi-organ failure and eventually a slowing and erratic heart rate, which would indicate to the person who is experiencing this that they were right at the point of death. If by some miracle someone on a cross hung on for life for a long time, which again, many people were already in critical condition before they were even put up on a Roman cross. But if by some miracle they would hang on, the Romans made sure they died by taking a club and shattering their leg bones so they could no longer push up with their feet and breathe. And if they thought they were already dead, they would thrust a spear into their side to ensure that they were fully dead. The Roman soldiers did this because their one job was to make sure that people fully died on a cross. If they did not do their job well, they themselves would be executed. Talk about a bad day at work. They themselves would be executed for this. And so they made sure that their victims fully died. And so Jesus is put on a cross. And again, as a bystander, I think we'd be watching this happen. And we would go, Jesus, you never said anything about this being the way in which you were going to be the Messiah. I mean, we've been watching your ministry, been watching all the amazing things you've said. Apparently, you include tax collectors and prostitutes, and you talk about the kingdom of God coming down to earth, the kingdom of heaven. You talk about love in this radical way. When are we supposed to overthrow the Romans? When are we finally going to be free from captivity of the Romans? Nobody thought it would end like this. As a bystander, they're watching him hanging, dying slowly on a cross. And I would imagine there's a question that pops in their mind, a question that pops in our mind maybe, perhaps, or that we've wrestled with before. A very simple question of why? Why? Jesus, why are you letting this happen? Why is this how your story is ending? What is the purpose behind all of this? It's a question we all face when we read the story of the cross of Jesus. And in a moment, Jesus is hanging there, and the gospel writers write down the sentence that he says hanging on the cross. It's almost like a prayer. And it gives the answer as to why Jesus' story becomes a part of your story and my story. It gives the answer as to why we should all lean in the story of the cross of Christ. Because he says this sentence hanging there. He says, Father, forgive them. Forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. See, every drop of blood, every excruciating breath, every lash of the Roman whip and the flogging had all been about this word right here. It had all been about forgiveness. Well, why forgiveness? Because since the beginning, there was a break between humanity and God. There was this disconnect between humanity and God all the way back to the Garden of Eden, the original sin. God created a world with free will. He had to do that to create a world with love, because if there is no free will, there is no love. We're all just automatons, we're robots, we just do exactly as we're told. But with a meaningful choice, with free will, there is an option to obey or not obey. And within this free will, since the beginning, we've all had this propensity towards sin, to live outside of God's design, to operate in our own understanding, not according to what God says. We all have this kind of gravitational pull. And I just want to say really quick, if you struggle with the reality of sin, all you need to do to understand sin is have a toddler, okay? I promise you, it's a very expensive and time-consuming way to understand this. There's probably a more efficient route, but you will know that sin is a reality. We all have this propensity to do the very thing we ought not to do, we think we know we ought not to do. And because of sin, there is this debt created between us and God. And this debt is created essentially because God, by definition, being God, is perfect. He is holy. Being perfect and holy, everything about his character must embody perfection. And so there is a debt because when we sin, when we try to live outside of God's design, it creates a debt that must be satisfied. It creates a justice that must be dealt with. To which we go, well, why does there have to be a justice? Why does there have to be a debt that is paid? But if you think about it like this, if we're all in a courtroom, and God is the judge, and we see someone who has done wrong, they've done bad, and we all know it, the evidence is there, we all know they've done wrong, and then God just says, you know what? Don't worry about it. I get out of jail free card, I'll just give you a warning. It's no biggie, just go on throughout your day. We would all go, well, that is not a just judge. That is an imperfect verdict. That leads to an imperfect judge. God, by definition, he is perfect. He is holy. He is set apart, which means there must be a perfect justice, which means in this break between us and God, there must be something that pays the penalty of sin, satisfies the debt and the justice of God. And so in the very beginning, in God, in his mercy, he created this system between humans, the nation of Israel, and himself. He created this system called the Old Covenant. It's written about, talked about in the Old Testament. We know it was temporary because it started in a tent. It was a temporary system, but it was a way in which the Jewish people could reconcile themselves back to God. What they would do is they would take their best animal without blemish, their resources, their food, and they would sacrifice this to give to God to pay the penalty and satisfy the debt. They would do this regularly, but this was just a temporary system. It had always alluded to a new system, a permanent system called the New Covenant, in which this Messiah would come and satisfy the justice of God once for all. But here's the thing that nobody expected. Nobody expected this to happen on a Roman cross. Everybody had been with Jesus up until that point, but then on the Roman cross, nobody expected this to be the way in which the new covenant finally came and the justice of God was finally satisfied. But what we often miss when we read this story, and what we often miss, and the people there who are bystanders most likely missed as well, is that if Jesus had taken one of the options to save himself, he would have forfeited his ability to save you and to save me. To reconcile us back to God, there had to be a justice that was satisfied, a debt that was paid. The Apostle Paul summarizes this entire thing in a letter to the Romans. He says it like this. He says, consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, one sin, the original sin, resulted in disconnection between us and God, so also one righteous act, Jesus dying on the cross, resulted in justification, satisfying the justice of God and his perfection and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, look at this, so also through the obedience, the sinlessness, the perfection, the righteousness of the one man, Jesus of Nazareth, the many will be made righteous, be reconciled back to God. The thing that made Jesus different than any other sacrifice up until this point is that he was undeserving. He was both divine and human. He was both God and man. He embodied God's perfection, and so he was not deserving of the death he died. He did it for you and I to pay the penalty that we ultimately deserved for the forgiveness of sins. It's why the story had to end at the cross of Jesus to pay the penalty once for all, the new covenant. That's why he said, Father, forgive them. We see symbolism of this, maybe a few minutes, maybe a few hours, we don't know for sure. As Jesus is hanging on the cross, something else transpires in the city of Jerusalem that kind of symbolizes this whole point. It says this, it says, by this time it was about noon, and darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. The light from the sun was gone, and suddenly the curtain in the sanctuary in the temple was torn down the middle. There was this big curtain that separated the people from the presence of God, and in this moment, it's torn down the middle to symbolize the old covenant is done. The new covenant has now been established. And then we read the end of Jesus' life. Then Jesus shouted, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. And with those words, he breathed his last. We believe the Apostle John is there watching this happen. And in his account of Jesus' life, he has this statement that summarizes all of this entire thing, all of the investigating, the outcome you get to in all of it. It's a statement that you might see on bumper stickers. It's the most quoted verse in all of the New Testament because of its simplicity in describing all of this. And then in John 3:16, it says, for God so loved the world. God was not okay with that disconnect happening. He intervened. He loved the world that he gave his one and only son, gave something infinitely of value, that whoever believes in him, puts their trust in him, shall not perish. That word perish literally means won't be disconnected or lost anymore, but be reconciled back to God and have eternal life. Reconciled to God and have eternal life in heaven with God one day. It was the single greatest act of love in history. I had a friend of mine who recently kind of went on a journey of exploring, investigating Jesus, really the most honest investigation of Jesus that I've ever seen or been on the other side of, just question after question after question, reading, considering, all of these things. And he got to this point where he decided to put his faith in Christ. He just said the evidence was there, and he'd been out on church for decades. He had a really hard time kind of thinking about the idea of a good, loving, heavenly Father. But he got to this point after all the evidence, and in reflecting back on it, he said that the thing that stuck out to him, and the thing that really was a changing point for him, was this whole idea of God sacrificing his son. See, my friend had recently had his own son, his first child, and he said the thing I couldn't get over was this whole idea of God sacrificing his son, because there is nothing, nobody, no reason in which I would ever be willing to sacrifice my son for anything or anybody else. He said, but if God did that for me, well, that means he loves me infinitely more than I can possibly imagine, and it changes everything about my life. See, it is the greatest point of love in history. It is both God the Son dying on the cross, giving of his life, and God the Father giving of his Son at the same time to reconcile us back to him. We have a hard time trying to understand the amount of love given on the cross in this moment. But my favorite author that I shamelessly quote and talk about far too much, his name is Brendan Manning. And he attempts to explain the unexplainable like this. He says, I could more easily contain Niagara Falls in a teacup than I can comprehend the wild, uncontainable love of God. Trying to understand the love of God would be like having a teacup at the bottom of the Niagara Falls and trying to catch all the water. Uncontainable, wild, unimaginable. We can't even wrap our minds around a love like that God has for you and that he has for me. And this is not a love based on what you do. This is not a love based on your best day or your worst day. It's not a love based on what you think about yourself when you look at yourself in the mirror. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not so good. So often we project our attitude towards ourselves onto God, and we think because we don't like us that God must not like us either. This is not a love based on that. It is a love not based on how you should be, but simply just how you are right in this moment. The wild, uncontainable love of God for you demonstrated on the cross of Jesus Christ. Today, as we wrap up this series we've been in the past couple weeks, investigating Jesus, we've explored a lot. We've talked about a lot. In a second, we're going to end. The band's coming out. We're going to end with a moment for all of us. But the irony in all of this is we've talked about this being the end of the story of Jesus. But we all know that this wasn't the end. Otherwise, there'd be no Easter celebration next week. And all of this would fall apart. But up until this point, we're going to get there next week. We're going to talk about that. We're going to even investigate some of that next week. But the outcome of all of this investigating up until this point is really an invitation. An invitation to you and your story, however you find yourself here today, however you find yourself listening or even watching online. Maybe for you in here, you would say you've already accepted God's love in your life. But if you're honest, there are moments where you know it in your mind, but you don't really believe it. Maybe you feel like, God loves me, but I don't think God really likes me that much. And maybe for you, an invitation in reading the story of the cross and Jesus paying this penalty is just an invitation for you to allow the love of God to move a little bit further down to your heart from your mind than it is right now. Maybe that's where you're at. Perhaps you're in here and you've been exploring and investigating Jesus and you've been tracking along, but you still have questions. Maybe for you, you're here for the very first time and you're like, yeah, Jeremy, this was pretty heavy. Thanks a lot for that, right? But maybe for you, you're here for the first time, you're still exploring, investigating. My urge to you would be don't stop investigating just because this series is done. Again, if this is true, the implications on your life are endless. I think you owe it to yourself to do everything you can to find out whether or not that's true. That's why we started off talking about Starting Point, a group for anybody in here who's exploring and asking questions. Again, I'll just shamelessly plug it. You can text Starting Point to 97000. If that's you and you have questions about Christianity, spirituality, this group starts in 2 weeks. It's an amazing place to go to explore those questions. Or perhaps you're in here, and up until this point in your journey of investigating Jesus, exploring the identity of Jesus, maybe for you, you're at that point to go, you know what? I think I have enough to go off of. But you just haven't made that decision yet. Maybe for you, the dots are connecting and you're going, yeah, I can't ignore this anymore. And maybe it's been intellectual, or perhaps you've been trying to save yourself in your life and you're recognizing that only one can truly save you, and that is the person of Jesus on the cross. What I want to do today, we started off talking about moments. And what I want to do today is end by providing what I hope is a marker moment for you and your story and your journey and how you relate to God. I just want to really invite you and challenge you to take that step of faith, to put your faith and trust in Christ and provide a moment for you to do so. We often think, oh, it's got to be this experience or this thing, or we got to do kumbaya, 1, 2, 3, fancy prayer. It's none of those things. It's just opening your hands between you and God and saying, God, I believe that you sent your son to die on the cross for my sins to reconcile me back to you. I put my faith in that. and receiving God's love for you and your life. I want to give you a moment to do that. Our band is going to just sing a song over you. You don't have to stand or anything, and you don't have to sing if you don't want to. You can just read the lyrics, but they're going to sing a song over you called How Deep the Father's Love for Us. It's an old hymn, and it just tells the story of the cross and the story of what happened for you in that moment. And I want to give you the opportunity to make that decision wherever you might be. And then I'll come back out and wrap us up.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond our measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretched treasure. How great the pain of sin, the Father turns His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. It's I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. His wounds have paid my ransom, but this I know with all my heart. His wounds have paid my ransom.
I hope that today served as a reminder for all of us. But if you're in here and you just took that bold step to trust Jesus with your life, then I just want you to know the scriptures say that there is a party going on in heaven for you to celebrate that. And I don't want you to go a day without taking one more little step that I want to challenge you to do. And that is that I just want you to tell someone about it. If maybe it's the person who invited you or sent you the link to watch online, maybe it's a trusted family or friend that's a follower of Jesus. If you don't have anybody in mind, then maybe you reach out to our staff. Myself and some of our staff members will be out in the foyer at the What's Next kiosk. We would love to talk to you, celebrate with you, help you understand what's next on your faith journey. But again, for all of us, today, looking at the story of the cross, forgiveness, and love, it's a reminder that the cross was a moment in which Jesus' breath was taken away, but at the same time, our sin was taken away with it. And 3 days later, the unexpected happened. He rose from the dead to prove that it was all true. And we're going to celebrate that next week, Easter weekend. We can't wait to see you. Thank you guys for being here today.